Is culture a product of will, or is it a product of inheritance? Check it out.
If you think that culture is a product of will, then you want the state to enforce a particular, say, moral script. If, though, you think like me, culture is a product of inheritance, then I think you want to fight to protect pluralistic spaces where families, churches, and communities can shape their own way of life. And so I think that tension, is culture a product of will or is a product of inheritance, is sort of how I've come to think about some of the tensions that are playing out in the current debate.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Shawn Whatley, and today we have Sean Speer back with us again. Sean is a lecturer at the Munk School of Public Policy. He's a senior fellow at the Public Policy Forum. He's a former senior economic advisor for the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and he's currently editor-at-large at The Hub. Most importantly, Sean Speer has been at the center of all the biggest debates in conservatism and the conservative movement in Canada over the last many decades. He's had an ongoing discussion with Anthony Koch. Anthony and Sean have been having an ongoing debate about whether or not the state can remain neutral. Can the state take the position of not favoring any kind of heritage, cultural symbols, history, etc.? Anthony says, no, it's impossible. There's no such thing as a neutral state or a neutral institution, and we need to actually put forward a conservative vision for the country. Sean Speer says, hang on, if we start doing that, we're going to let the progressives push their vision onto Canada. Anthony would say, well, that's already happened, and we just need to wake up and push back and take back control and insist on a conservative vision of Canada. And Sean Speer says, no, hang on, you don't know what you're asking for. This could lead to some really dark places. So it's a fundamental divide that we have right now within conservative discussions, and it's wonderful. I don't want to say that it's a divide in a bad way, that it'll lead to division and argument. This is the kind of fundamental debate that leads to a rich and vibrant conservative movement in Canada. We're at a moment now where people are feeling a need for something more than just a hotel. Canada needs to hold together. We need to find our sense of stickiness. What does it mean to be Canadian? What does it mean to be a conservative in Canada? What does Canadian conservatism mean? Is it just about the economy and the rule of law and a neutral proceduralism? Or is it about meaning and inheritance and symbols and a shared cultural sense that binds us together? Now, I'm not saying meaning in government, but an affectionate attachment to the state. Is that part of what it means to have a conservative approach to government and to politics? Anyways, we had a fascinating discussion. We talked about fusionism and how we can actually work this out on a practical level. So fascinating discussion. I hope you have as much fun with this as I did. Let's get on with the show. Sean Speer, welcome.
It's always great to talk to you, Sean.
I appreciate you making the time, man. I know you have a very full schedule. So in the introduction, we've already set this up as an ongoing discussion with you and Anthony Koch, but I also wanted to highlight the work that you have done through your organization, The Hub, in highlighting other people within this discussion. So I'm thinking of Howard Anglin and others. The Hub has taken, you're up to your neck in this, man. You've done such a good job at really bringing out the richness and depth of the ideas within this broader discussion. And it happens to be a discussion that you've been opining on and speaking into for maybe a decade or more. I was researching some of your old articles. So I just wanted to open up by saying, Sean Speer, help us make sense of this whole space. And at the same time, if you want to respond to Anthony at this point, go ahead, or we'll get into it a bit later.
This is what animates me. This is what motivates me. I wake up every day, Sean, grateful that I have found a way to make this a living. When I was a young person, I fell in love with conservative ideas and conservative institutions. And I remember in Thunder Bay telling my parents that this is sort of what I wanted to do for a living. And my parents were enormously supportive, but I must admit, a a bit confused about it all. And here I am, 43 years old, and for the better part of the past 20 years, through academic life, think tanks, direct involvement in politics, I've managed to be part of these really rich and important discussions about, amongst other things, what it means to be a conservative in Canada and how that manifests itself in the world of policy and politics. Last month marked the 7th anniversary of the launch of National Review magazine, the 100th birthday of its founder, William F. Buckley Jr. And if you go back, Sean, to that first 20 years or so of National Review, from the launch in 55 through to about the mid-70s, when American conservatism really starts to coalesce around the candidacy of Ronald Reagan, these are precisely the debates that are playing out on the pages of National Review. The masthead comprises a range of figures, from libertarians like Frank Meyer to traditionalists like Russell Kirk. And the story goes that that there was never a moment when everyone on the masthead was on speaking terms, because they were really, through the magazine, kind of working out what it meant to be a conservative in 20th century America, how to balance the inherent tensions within conservatism, often along these lines of liberty and order and freedom and virtue. And so when we launched the Hub, of course, we aspired it to be a popular website that people can come to for news and commentary. Of course, we have to pay the bills, and so that means publishing content that is of broader interest. But I always had this aspiration at some level of my consciousness that I wanted to play that same role that National Review had played in that formative period in the middle of the 20th century. And so in that sense, people think that these types of debates are heated and contentious, and at times people have asked me, how I feel about it. Am I okay? I've had the most fun in the past few weeks that I've had in a long time. This is precisely what I want to be doing, and as I say, I'm so grateful that I've found a way to do it.
Wow. That is magnanimous, right? And it comes through in the way you present yourself in your discussions. And some of these discussions are really quite spicy, and I love it. And if we can maintain that tone, I hate to use tone and temperament because that's been thrown against the new right? You guys have the wrong tone. It's an attitude, it's an approach, it's an openness, and like you said, an excitement to engage in these ideas. So again, kudos to you.
And I think there's kind of one key message from what I just set out, that is that the exchange that we're having feels contingent and particularistic. We're talking in a particular moment about a particular place, about a particular set of circumstances, but we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this is not a new conversation. This is really at the heart of at least North American conservatism. In recent weeks, I've gone back and read a collection of essays that was edited by Frank Meyer called "What is Conservatism?"
Yeah.
And in the latest edition, Jonah Goldberg, who of course you and many of your listeners and viewers will know, wrote the foreword. And I won't read it at length, but if you'll just permit me,
please.
He says, quote, "Because at the end of the day, liberty and order, or freedom and virtue, cannot be permanently reconciled. They are at once mutually dependent and at war, a bickering couple that cannot live without each other. At any given moment, one might have the better argument than the other, but tomorrow is another day. Life is full of contradictions and conflicts, and the story of Western civilization, the only true fundament of modern conservatism, is the story of these contradictions and conflicts being worked out over millennia." Fusionism, the idea associated with Meyer, who sought to reconcile some of these tensions, is a failure, according to Goldberg, if one looks at it as a source for what to think, but is a deciding success if one sees it as a guide for how to think. It tells us that we must always try to balance these conflicting principles, albeit, in the words of Goldberg, and I would say in the words of Speer, with a thumb on the scale of liberty. That's fine because in the classical liberal tradition, the benefit of the doubt should always go to liberty, while the forces of coercion should meet an extra burden of proof, unquote. Now, that ending of Goldberg's characterization is obviously the subject of debate, but his broader point that these questions about how conservatives reconcile freedom and order and liberty and virtue, I think are at the heart of what it means to be, as I say, at least a North American conservative. And in that sense, twisting the dial on the respective role of these different ideas and impulses in response to new and emerging and dynamic questions about how we live together and how we organize our economy and all the rest is really at the heart of conservatism and thus, as I say, why I'm so grateful that I get to be part of these conversations.
Yeah, brilliant. And I love that book. I have it on my shelf right across. I can't reach it from here, but it's a great book. And we'll put a link to it in the show notes. So why don't we jump in then from using that springboard? And one of the core foundations of fusionism is taking the two aspects, shall we say, economic liberalism and appreciation of free markets, freedom, rule of law, as well as what's been called social conservatism, but you could call it cultural conservatism, traditionalism, a love of home and place and country. And in some areas that will include a preference for religion, for Christianity. But I would say more broadly speaking, especially today, the Christian emphasis has really waned, and it's really talking about tradition, culture, heritage, where we come from, symbols that bind us together. And so fusionism in its best light is I was going to say marriage. That's not really the right word. It's a coalition between these two ideas. Yeah, sorry. It's a loaded word these days. A coalition between these two approaches. So having said that, part of the energy in the current debate surrounds the presupposition, I would say, on the economic liberal side, that institutions can be neutral. This concept of having neutral proceduralism, and that's a good thing. Now, this is a trap, Sean, so be careful how you answer this. So I want to ask you, is institutional neutrality a myth? But before you answer, I got quite a bit of emotion on this topic from Yuval Levin, so someone that we both admire. And Yuval Levin actually, I won't say what he said. So I'll let Sean Speer answer this and tell me what you think about institutional neutrality. Is it good? Is it possible? Or is it a total myth? I think Anthony Koch would be fine with me saying that he argues it's a myth. You can't have institutional neutrality. And I'm saying Sean Speer would say, no, this is a good thing that we need to aim for. So tell me how I got this wrong and share your opinion on it.
Yeah, there's so much to say, and maybe we'll come back later to the question of fusionism and how we ought to think about it, and its Canadian roots, because, well, of course, it's an idea associated with 20th century American conservatism and the debates, as we've been discussing, that play out on the pages of National Review and the broader American conservative movement. I would say that fusionism it has been part of a Canadian conservatism from the beginning. It's often forgotten that that MacDonald's first party is the Liberal Conservatives. In a way, the mutuality of these ideas and impulses are in the kind of DNA of Canadian conservatism, in my judgment. And as I say, perhaps we can talk about that later. On the subject of neutrality, I would say that, broadly speaking, neutrality should be an aspiration. Of course, perfect neutrality can't be fully achieved. As we were talking before we started recording, George Will's book Statecraft to Soulcraft, I think, persuasively makes the case that to govern is to choose, and to choose means having to make some normative assumptions about the functioning of institutions, etc. But one of my deepest political commitments is the idea of pluralism, and not the kind of mushy 21st century pluralism, but the idea that one, we all have equal dignity, and two, we all define and author our lives and our understanding of the world on our own, or within our own families and local networks, and we ought to create as much space as possible for people to live out their personal conception of the good life and human flourishing, free from the kind of homogenizing instincts of the state. Before we got speaking today, I went back and read some of the speeches and writings of Alexander Galt, who I think is the most underrated figure in the Confederation project. He is the champion, as you know, of federalism and subsidiarity through 1865 to 1867, a champion ultimately of Canada's federal structure, precisely because he was motivated by how to reconcile difference in a society that had difference rooted in its own DNA. And I think he was broadly correct in how he thought about those questions. And as we grapple with even greater degree of heterogeneity and difference, I think all things being equal, the state should broadly aspire to the notion of neutrality, precisely because I think people ought to be able to live out those values and preferences, and seek meaning and purpose on their own, free from the impositions of the state.
Yeah. Yeah, so well said. I mean, it's impossible to argue with you, Sean. You're just such a clear thinker. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to argue with you.
What did Yuval say, by the way?
Yes, that's where I'm going. Yeah, here's the trap, man. I was bringing it. It's not much of a trap. It's not a trap at all. You're going to say, well, Yuval's smart, and I agree with him too. So when I had Yuval on the podcast, I was really excited to have him on.
Of course.
One of the questions I asked him was about neutral proceduralism. And we were talking about institution building, and his last book is really a call to reemphasize Congress. And he, so I presented to him, I said, well, Yuval, you're just talking about neutral proceduralism as kind of like a bunch of experts making the world work. And now that's a straw man of what you just said. You didn't say that, so I'm trying to make what you just said sound in its worst possible light. But when I said neutral proceduralism to Yuval, he said, no, it's nothing neutral about it. He said, this is the right way to do it. He said, this leads to human flourishing. And so he highlighted, and I'm being more emotional than Yuval is. Yuval's very thoughtful and clear, and he's professorial. He said, no, we follow a neutral procedure because it is good. So he framed it as a moral case. And actually, I just got my copy of Modern Age, journal in the mail the other day. And lo and behold, right in the editorial, Daniel McCarthy sets up exactly what we're talking about. And he said there's a fundamental moral divide between people who say that it's good to have affectionate ties, including patriotism, even if they are inefficient. People will say that's a good moral thing. And he said on the other side of the aisle, people will say, well, hang on a second. We need to be impersonal and unbiased because it leads to greater utility, which leads to human flourishing. So that is a moral good. So on one side, he said, we have a bias towards utility, and it's good primarily and precisely because it is unbiased, because it is impersonal, because it is quote unquote neutral. That's what makes it a good thing. So when you're thinking of economic liberalism or globalism, so it's good because no one has a finger on the scale. versus the other side of the aisle in this debate, where people are saying, no, it's actually a good thing to have affectionate ties, including patriotism. And the other side of the aisle would say, well, actually, those ties are irrelevant to the function of government, if not outright harmful to the function of government. And so I think that's the crux of this issue, where people are saying those ties are actually harmful, and the people on the ties side, the affection side, are saying, well, actually, you guys saying that it's all about utility, you're aiming at the wrong thing. And so it's a moral contest. Go ahead.
Well, so I think I'm afraid I disagree with that. That I am not making a utilitarian argument or expressing a hostility to non-economic sensibilities or affections. It's funny. I've been called a libertarian for stressing this principle of neutrality, but what I'm really trying to do, Sean, is protect space for people of faith and others to live out their values without being crowded out by an activist state. In a pluralistic society where conservatives, particularly religious conservatives, are an increasing minority, neutrality, in my mind, isn't about utilitarianism. It's about a shield. It's about protecting room for people to live out their values. Like I mentioned Goldberg earlier. Goldberg, as you know, is fond of the phrase that conservatism is comfort with contradiction, and that's how I feel. At 43, I've never been more conservative in my life. We were speaking before we got started. My kids go to classical Christian school. I myself have a stronger relationship to my faith than I've had before. I have a surplus of meaning and purpose that I think is partly a function of being a father to young children. And I want to, but on the same token, I'm more liberal in my politics precisely because I want to protect as much space for me and my family and for other families across the country or other societies to be able to live out their values and preferences free from state imposition. And so I have liberal means, if I can put it that way, but they're in pursuit of conservative ends.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's such a beautiful answer. And listening to you almost made me wonder whether or not we're making a category mistake. And you're saying we're talking about two things that are not in contest, and we should not frame this as a contest of two equal and opposite categories, but we're talking about two completely equal and opposite positions within the same category. We're actually talking about two separate categories. We're talking about vegetables versus animals, right? A different category of things here. And so a beautiful answer. And I wish I had Yuval here to ask him about it, because he probably would have build on that too. So you mentioned Galt, and super nerdy. In thinking about our conversation coming up, you're going to laugh at me. I actually ordered from Amazon Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution. It just arrived yesterday. And so my family, my girls especially, and my wife, they love The Crown, the Netflix series. And
Yes.
in season 1 of The Crown, this is before Queen Elizabeth is Elizabeth. She's just Lilibet, and she's being instructed. I don't know if you've seen the episode, but she's being instructed about the English Constitution. And her tutor says, well, what are the two features of the Constitution? She said, well, there's the efficient and the dignified. And he said, good, excellent. And which part is the crown? She said, oh, the dignified. Great, excellent. And what is the purpose? And so he's teaching Bagehot. And Bagehot's, one of his main arguments is that there's two aspects in the Constitution, broadly speaking. One of it is to get things done, That's the efficient side, and that's what we see in, the House of Commons, legislature, executive. And then we also see the dignified, which is history, affection, ties, customs, all the accoutrements of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the other ideas that Bagehot talks about is cabinet government. And a lot of people would say, well, cabinet government doesn't exist anymore. We just have parties that fight each other. But he said, in cabinet, you have cabinet ministers, and they are ministers of the crown. So they are kind of hanging on to that dignified aspect, but they're also members of the legislature. And so they are, guiding the machinery of the executive. And so they're on the efficient side as well. And so he says this is just beautiful. It doesn't exist anywhere around the world. It's only in the English Constitution. So I'm wondering whether the calls that we're hearing to emphasize culture, connection, patriotism aren't really, in the language of Bagehot, a call to remember the dignified aspect of our English Constitution. Canada has the English Constitution. It's unwritten.
Yes.
It goes back 800 years. British North America Act was just an act. Well, it's called the Constitution Act now. So I've shown you all my cards, and I want you to reflect on that. Do you think that's just too weird and useless?
No,
Go ahead.
I think there's really something there, and I think people are increasingly concerned about those questions precisely because our population is transforming, and there is a concern that we won't have the kind of connective tissue that enables us to live together with a shared understanding of citizenship, so that Canada doesn't become a political geography devoid of a common citizenship, a shared sense of understanding of the country, and so on. And I understand that impulse, and I broadly agree with it. It's something that I've written about, and we've published a lot at the Hub. What is a civic nationalism in an era where, last year, Sean, more than 40% of babies born in Canada were to foreign-born mothers. We are embarking on a kind of pretty radical experiment when it comes to diversity and pluralism, and it's natural for people, particularly conservatives, to be concerning themselves with questions of how do we create a kind of shared culture, if I can put it that way. I must admit, though, my most radical view in 2025 as a 43-year-old happily married husband and father of two young kids is those issues don't motivate me as much as they used to. When I was younger, I would have been with these younger people writing about, what does it mean to be Canadian, and what is Canadian culture, and what is Canadian identity. As a young person, I was even interested in trying to cultivate a kind of Indigenous Canadian conservatism, because I was, I lamented that, that we were part of this Anglo-American story, and so I elevated obscure Canadian conservative figures because it gave me a sense of intellectual and political continuity and all the rest. I, as I said earlier, one of the extraordinary things about becoming a parent is my search for meaning and purpose has ended. I have a surplus, and so in that sense, and by the way, I think that my experience is not distinct. That there exists this conversation, this meta conversation about identity and culture and all the rest. But I think most of us derive our meaning and purpose not from those meta sources. We derive it from local and familial sources. And so if you look at it big picture, you think, oh, the culture is unhealthy. People are attenuated. We risk becoming a hotel society, not a home society. But for me, that conversation is disconnected from where people really do find meaning and purpose. And that's why I'm, as I say, decentralization and pluralism have become so fundamental to my political worldview. And it's not just a kind of philosophical perspective. It really is a kind of deeply personal one, that I don't have that. I'm not searching anymore. I found it, and I want to protect it, and I want to protect space for others to find kind of similar purpose and meaning in being a spouse, or being a father, or a mother, or being a church member, or being a civic leader. Joe Clark was ridiculed when he described Canada as a community of communities. And I suspect those on the new right would criticize it as having kind of insufficient connective tissue, almost a slogan for a hotel society. But to be honest, at this point in my life, community of communities sounds not so bad, to be honest. Now, how we then go about improving the conditions for in those communities is a crucial question, of course. But my most radical view today is that I'm increasingly kind of disinterested in these like questions of national identity, and much more interested in how we create the conditions for people to find their own sense of identity and purpose and meaning, much closer to home.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I'm struggling to find things to argue with you on, Sean, and I'm not here to argue, but this is beautiful. I love it all. So let's see if I can steal.
Like you have.
Go ahead.
So you have four children.
I do. Yeah.
Talk a bit because my sense is you do have. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but you do have some dispositions to some of the arguments that are being made about the
Yes.
need for a collective culture, and even though you have kind of small L liberal views on economics and so on, and indeed even on how to improve the outcomes within our healthcare system, when it comes to these non-materialistic questions, you're more open to the use of the state to try to support some of these forms of shared culture and shared citizenship. So talk a bit about that, but also talk about you're someone who I sense has an abundant supply of purpose and meaning in your marriage, and your as a father, as a physician, as a Christian. Talk a bit about these different perspectives or identities reflected in you yourself.
Yeah. So it's not fair, Sean. I get to ask all the questions. No, but I'll take the opportunity. Absolutely. And I would agree with actually everything that you said. Your meaning and purpose starts inside your home, yourself initially as an individual,
Yes.
and listening to your own conscience and following it from there. I think we all have a sense of beauty in our lives around us, truth. We have a sense of goodness. I always use the example of, everybody in Canada knows you're not supposed to drive across the mother duck and the ducklings in the spring, right?
Yes.
You slam on your brakes. You just know that. You know that to be true. You've written yourself about the need for grandmas, right? I was looking for that article that you wrote. You'll have to give me the link for it. Where you said,
what's the old phrase? Conservatism is basically just, if you had to sum it up, it's just that your grandma was right.
yeah, exactly. No, I love that. I love that. So all of this is true. And at the same time, I think, and I don't have this fully developed into an opinion, but I think there's a role for the state to play in conserving, dare we use that word, the dignified aspect of the state itself. So if we share the English Constitution, I believe we have. It goes all the way back 800 years, right? Magna Carta, habeas corpus, Bill of Rights, all of this that predates the establishment of Canada itself. If we don't acknowledge that, celebrate it, express our gratitude for it, and be honest about the messiness, the mistakes that were made. Absolutely.
Yes.
But that's the point of history. History is a long list of trial and error where we can say, oh, yeah, that was a mistake. Better not do that again. Or maybe the situation has changed, and so prudence would guide us to do something else. But your comments about a lack of meaning and purpose at the individual level, family level, the community level, I agree with all that. Having said that, that doesn't mean that people are displacing a felt need in themselves. What is Samuelson's, the socialist economist, expressed needs versus stated needs?
Yes.
Yeah, I forget how that.
So,
Go ahead.
So you don't think that some of the appeal to this more top-down culture making is not in part a reflection of people seeking out meaning and purpose in politics?
Oh, I would 100% agree with you, and not even in part, perhaps in large part, especially when we see the passion and energy on the folks who are left of center. They're broken,
Yes.
psychologically broken,
Yes.
bawling their eyes out.
Empirically so, right?
Yeah.
There's evidence that
Yeah,
yes.
and we're not trying to make fun of them. I'm saying these people are really, really hurting. So to your point is so well taken. I couldn't agree more. A strong society requires strong citizens, and we can't depend on government to all of a sudden create strong citizens. That being the case, I still think there's the need for the state to play a role. So again, I'll nerd out for you. So a lot of people have been criticizing Edmund Burke, and I've had a love-hate relationship with Burke. I'm like, oh man, he's so hard to understand sometimes. But and Tom Flanagan said this, oh, Sean, the words mean nothing. Edmund Burke, the so-called father of conservatism, he was a Whig, and a Whig was a liberal. So if you look at what Burke was saying, though, he was a proponent of constitutionalism. So he loved the English Constitution, and he wanted a balance of authority. He was really worried about too much power with the monarchy, and he wanted to protect the liberties that England had already achieved to that point. So he was very pro-liberty, and he was pro-English Constitution versus the new Whigs or the younger Whigs. They were pro-liberalism. They were about advancing this political philosophy of, you're a blank slate, you do you're a lump of plasticine. We can remake the whole Constitution if we want and start over again and make it better. So more the ethos of the French Revolution.
Yes.
I'm suggesting that, now I can't speak for members on the new right, but my sense is that they're looking for that continuity, even though, I was teasing Jeff Russ. I said, Jeff, don't tell people not to read Edmund Burke's Reflections. They need to read it more because he's really saying this very prudential approach. He was against the French Revolution, but he loved the American Revolution. And so what can we learn from that? All of this presupposes the state taking a strong position to celebrate that English Constitution, that history, that culture. Now, is that too radical of approach for Sean Speer?
No, probably not. I mean, let me just try to communicate this in a way that it's logical in my own mind. So, first order of business, push back against the progressive non-neutrality of public institutions that we've seen play out over the past several years. There's no dispute about that. That involves possibly a set of institutional changes. It involves, in some instances, curriculum changes. It may, as I've argued in different places, may involve defunding certain institutions and subjecting them to the rigors of market forces. And I don't just mean economic forces. I mean having to go out and persuade people that these are ideas and initiatives that ought to be the subject of support. One of the harms of the increasing non-neutrality of different institutions under progressive leadership is that I don't think they are reflective of kind of small d democratic impulses but these people have been successful at kind of arbitraging the state. And so there is an entire network, for instance, of nonprofit organizations that live and die on public funds, and which enables them to essentially go over individual Canadians and not have to persuade them that their cause is just and worthy. And so, in some cases, defunding these institutions and subjecting them to the kind of whims of the public could arguably be, in my mind, one of the most successful ways to kind of prosecute the so-called culture war, because a lot of those institutions would discover that that there isn't popular support for their perspective, and they would either have to change or close. So first order of business, there's no disagreement with me that we need to restore neutrality as to the extent possible in institutions that have deviated from the mission, as you've also brilliantly put it, and then celebrating some basic inheritances, as you've put it. Similarly, I don't have an objection to. If we can't agree on some broad aspects of the Canadian political tradition, then we're in pretty big trouble. I went back and looked at the British North American Act, rule of law, representative self-government, negative rights, division of powers, the kind of inherent pluralistic structure we're talking about, a limited state sphere. These are inheritances that are fundamental to the success of Canada as a society. And so, of course, I don't think we should be self-conscious about making that case, and in some instances, I suppose, using the role of the state to do so, particularly, for instance, in public education. Where I've reacted most negatively, Sean, I must admit, and part of it probably is a function just of polemical writing, is that at times you do encounter from members of the new right, or maybe those adjacent to them, a perspective that sort of sounds like culture is a product of will, that it isn't something that is organically shaped through some of the institutions we've been talking about, faith, family, civil society, and so on. But there's almost like a Nietzschean ideal that whoever has power gets to impose their vision on society, and in so doing kind of engineer cultural outcomes or cultural motifs. And I think that is mostly wrong as a kind of matter of history. But I also think it's wrong from a normative point of view, because as we've been discussing, the state by its nature is necessarily homogenizing. And so an understanding of culture making through that lens necessarily comes at the expense of pluralism. It necessarily comes at the expense of the particularities of faith communities, or other sources of meaning and purpose. And so let me put it to you this way. I apologize for being a bit clumsy, but I think that if you think that culture is a product of will, then you want the state to enforce a particular, say, moral script. If, though, you think like me, culture is a product of inheritance, then I think you want to fight to protect pluralistic spaces where families, churches, and communities can shape their own way of life. And so I think that tension, is culture a product of will or is a product of inheritance, is sort of how I've come to think about some of the tensions that are playing out in the current debate.
Yeah, I love it, love it. And I just talked with Ben Woodfinton the other day. He said, "I'm sorry, I'm rambling." I said, "No, Ben, you're not rambling. This is the point of podcasts. You're supposed to ramble so that we can finally get around to something."
Well, Ben's smarter than me, so his
I
rambling
don't, I don't
is
know.
more cogent.
He would
But
say the opposite.
but yeah, I really do like maybe a couple of other observations. Um, if you accept the premise that to be a Canadian conservative um, is to exist in this framework of ordered liberty that, as I say, I think goes back to um, has historical historical foundation, and in some ways, I think MacDonald himself kind of is a personification of these Tory sensibilities, but also existing in a kind of liberal uh, context. Then we're necessarily kind of toggling between order and liberty. And I accept the premise that in light of a bunch of the challenges that we're facing in 2025, the order part of ordered liberty probably is going to play a bigger role precisely because of demographic change and what that means for an understanding of shared citizenship and so on. So you won't find much in the way of disagreement from me. And as Goldberg says, that toggling between order and liberty is necessarily dynamic. It's never fixed. It will continue in perpetuity. Where I've intervened, like where I've decided to participate, is sort of less on that question and more on this one that I just set out. Is culture a product of will, or is it a product of inheritance? Is the proper purpose of politics to shape, to use public institutions to create that source of common culture, or is it about trying to free up the space for people to conceive of and live out their own understanding of the good life and human flourishing, and with some caveats, we wouldn't permit, certain lifestyles or certain points of view. I am personally inclined to the latter, and as I've been saying again a bit clumsily over the course of the conversation, I've become much stronger in that view, just by my by becoming a spouse and a father, that I maybe I was being a bit hyperbolic when I said that my politics today are leave me alone, but it's not too far from the truth. I want to protect this space for my little platoon here, to flourish and grow and define and author our lives. And I don't need politicians and bureaucrats in Ottawa or provincial capitals or city councils or international bodies, for that matter, getting in the way of that.
Yeah. I love what you said about will versus inheritance. Roger Scruton said that being a conservative is being honest about the attachments we've inherited and trying to live our lives out in such a way that we try to do today what we've inherited as being valuable. So I think you're solid on something. I share your apprehension about will and Nietzscheism, and that's one of the motivating factors for me for wanting to come up with something that is not progressivism, it's not liberalism, we could define those words more if we want, but is actually something that is rich and celebrates the inheritance that you talked about. Now, I wanted to throw this out there for you. In this discussion, as soon as you say inheritance, and this will be really nerdy, but we'll make it as simple for the audience as we can. So one of the core ideas especially in liberalism itself as a political philosophy, is a celebration of Hegel. And I don't understand Hegel. When I read Hegel, I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy is brutal. But one of his ideas is, we've all heard the term, we want to be on the right side of history, or the arc of history, right? History progresses, and that today is better than yesterday, tomorrow is going to be better today. And so this idea that we're moving forward into greater light, greater freedom, greater reason, all the rest. And so even though history was useful at the time and we did inherit it, it's not really very relevant today. We can kind of forget it. So it's kind of like learning math in grade 1. Once you're in grade 2, yeah, you should know what you learned in grade 1. We don't have to review that anymore. We got that. We're moving on from that. So that's a Hegelian view of history that animates our political discourse. And
Yes.
you're talking about celebrating inheritance as being live, relevant, salient to what's happening today. And so with that in mind, with kind of an anti-Hegelian vibe, I've been looking at, all these old authors, and we often say Adam Smith, a celebrated Markets. Well, of course, he wrote Theory of Moral Sentiments 17 years before, in 1759. He was at politics as a branch of moral philosophy. But even before Wealth of Nations, Samuel Johnson, like the Tory of the Tories. I am not a Tory, but the Tory of the Tories, 1769. I shared this with Flanagan too, because I happened to have read it just before we talked. Here's Samuel Johnson talking with, who's his author again? Anyways, the guy who writes the book, and I'll remember in a second, about the price of corn versus cattle. And that his interlocutor is saying, okay, Johnson, shouldn't we fix these prices? Because the prices keep changing. And Samuel Johnson says, no, of course not. When the price of corn is dear, the farmer should sell corn. And when cattle is dear, they should sell cattle. And so then he says, well, what about rent then for these tenant farmers? It's terrible that rent is so high. We should just pass a law to make it a certain, and Johnson said, absolutely not. He said, if the price of rent goes too high, then the farmers will go and become carpenters or machinists. And then he said, well, then we need to set the rent really low. And he said, no, of course not. It's within the landowner's best interest to have the rent set at an attractive rate so that they're always tenanted. Yes. He's describing market forces. Tory of the Tory is describing market forces 7 years before Wealth of Nations. And so there's many people in, the late 18th century that are talking about the things that we love: liberty, market freedom, free enterprise. And these ideas are coming from people that we would look at today and say, oh man, they're aristocrats and they didn't agree with universal suffrage or any of the other things that people like to celebrate today. My question for you is whether or not there's opportunity for us to just simply say, hey, this is what it is. This is where we get our ideas of the free market from. They're super old. And we're speaking against a Hegelian view of history where the old is bad and only tomorrow is good. So I just want to throw that out there for you and to say, is that the middle ground where we can say to, I'd like to think I'm perhaps an honorary member of the new right, but I it's not new. It's actually old. It's an old right that we're applying to the current moment. We're trying. Scruton said conservatism is a work of rescue. And so we rediscover these old ideas and apply them to the current moment. And your work as a young conservative, trying to find a made in Canada conservatism, I think that's exactly relevant to this current cultural moment. So I'll stop there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with what you set out, Sean. You mentioned Levin, who we both admire. Levin makes the case that one of the sources of kind of enduring strength of liberalism, broadly defined, is that it wasn't a intellectual construction. That what Locke and Hume and Burke and Smith and others were doing was describing how people were organizing themselves, oftentimes unknowingly, but in a way living out their Christian faith. There's a lot of research, for instance, on the Christian origins of liberalism and market capitalism, for that matter. So I agree with that. I agree with that. Uh, uh, I just think again, please let me be as generous as possible. I think it's outstanding that uh, that this new group of younger conservatives are out writing and talking about these issues. I disagree with the idea that Canadian conservatism as a kind of political project has been disproportionately libertarian. I think our libertarian friends would, for instance, disagree with that. But I think a legitimate criticism is that intellectual conservatism in Canada has been disproportionately libertarian. A lot of our think tanks, for instance, start from a kind of a small L or libertarian point of view, and we could talk about what explains that. Some of it is self-selection. Some of it is a lot of the funding, as you know, for these types of projects come from philanthropic foundations that they themselves have kind of libertarian worldviews, and so that influences the work that's done. So I think the fact that these young conservatives are thinking and writing about these issues and injecting a conservative, non-liberal or non-libertarian perspective into the world of intellectual conservatism is interesting and healthy. It goes back to our earlier conversation that this part of intellectual conservatism has been around for a long time and has played a crucial role in defining what it means to be a conservative, including, of course, in the work that that was done in the 20th century. If you go back, if you look at the contributors to Meyer's essay collection, Kirk, Kendall, Gary Wills, and others who brought that conservative point of view to the conversation. I also recognize that starting something new involves at times a polemical writing, which can be highly effective as a kind of tool, but it also at times can kind of obscure nuance, right? And I think one of the things we've heard a lot from a lot of the members of the New Right is that when you start to kind of talk to them more, there is more nuance than maybe is sometimes reflected in some of the writing. And as I say, that's just natural.
Yeah.
Where I would, at the risk of sounding like like an older an older voice, is I would caution them not to underestimate both the kind of limits of state action, but also the joy that comes from defining one's sense of meaning and purpose, and that my fear is even if one accepts that neutrality or however one describes it, is imperfect and at best an aspiration, I worry, Sean, that if we ever litigated the case, the first principles case against it, and we lost, which strikes me as a high probability given just the kind of nature of our country, we would be providing a permission structure or license to the other side to discard the one imperfect guardrail, imperfect protection that we have to live out our values. We were talking before. Your family is involved in a classical Christian church in Ontario.
Classical Christian school.
Yeah. Is pluralism perfect in Canada? No. Is neutrality perfect in Canada? No. but it's enabled that school to thrive.
Yeah.
And if we end up in a kind of Nietzschean conception of power and politics, such that we give a permission structure to the other side to eliminate the scope for institutions like that, or for people to live out values that diverge from, the kind of progressive center of gravity, it would be bad. And so I'm not naive, I'm not romantic, but what really motivates me is not even sort of philosophical inquiry as much as I enjoy it. It really is about trying to protect as much space for me and my family, and for families like mine, to live out their lives in ways that that those in power may find odd or peculiar or even distasteful.
Yeah.
And I just don't think we should underestimate how important that is, and and how wonderful it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. We could end there, but we have to have the last question, and I'm going to combine my last two questions. I've been saving the question about pluralism because you've mentioned it about 3 or 4 times. Two times, we'll say 2 or 3 times. Pluralism. Ray Penning says he doesn't believe in religious freedom for Aztecs, or Leo Strauss says, cultural. If all cultures are equal, then cannibalism is simply a matter of culinary taste. So I want you to dilate a little bit on pluralism as we close. And then also I want you to reflect on, it seems to me that your comments presuppose a greater amount of faith or trust. Deference is the wrong word. I think trust in government than many Canadians feel. So again, I was talking with Ray Pennings, and he said one feature of the American context, and you have the privilege of spending a fair bit of time in the States, is that Americans generally have a much, almost 2 or 3 times the amount of trust in government as a vehicle, as an institution, to protect their opportunities to have classical Christian schools, or to have faith communities of whatever kind of faith, not Christian, any kind of faith. And so Americans believe that government is there as a vehicle for them to protect those freedoms, to protect that pluralism that you value so much. He said, we don't see that in Canada at all. Actually, in Canada, we see the opposite. People who value those kinds of freedoms do not see the state as protecting them. In fact, they find that they live in a hostile environment. And
I broadly agree with that, except to say, Sean, that it, as I say, as imperfect as it is, I think if the new right vision played out in our politics, and it resulted in a kind of first principle contest over whose vision of the good life, or whose vision of culture free of pluralistic protections, would win out, I fear that they would be vanquished.
Yeah.
And the net effect is that we would actually give a permission structure to the other side to push even further in the direction of a kind of homogenized or consolidated progressive culture, which is to say, I'm in favor of trying to strengthen those pluralistic protections, whereas I would say that, I don't want to put words in some of these new right thinkers and writers, but they see politics. They see politics through the lens of this contestation of power, and that when one wins out, he or she then has the ability to effectively kind of impose themselves on the society, impose their ideals.
Yeah.
And I just think, with all due respect to these people, I'm not sure that there's a silent majority for their politics. And so it's a kind of long and clumsy way of saying, I don't disagree with Ray per se, but I would argue that notwithstanding the inadequacy of those pluralistic protections, they're the kind of best we have.
Yeah.
And I worry that if we challenge them root and branch and lose, which I suspect we would, then the other side would not even have to kind of nod to continuing to extend pluralistic protections to your wife's school,
Yeah.
or to, we know, for instance, that even in recent years, there's been behind the scenes talk about, for instance, repealing the tax advantages for places of worship. Um, uh, One, the Prime Minister Carney, to his credit, has dismissed or rejected that idea. But in a world where we kind of go for broke on pluralism and neutrality and lose, one could envision an idea like that resurfacing. So
Yeah.
I'm not naive or romantic about these questions. I kind of start from, in some ways, a conservative point of view about how do we protect what we have, and I would say that the new right would be more ambitious about not merely protecting what we have, but trying to push further, if I can put it that way. And maybe it's just my temperament, maybe it's my life stage in life. I'm worried about the kind of consequences of that type of politics.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, actually. And I have this debate in my family. They say, oh, we just need to outlaw this. And I go, are you crazy? If you outlaw that, that'll just be reversed and they'll make a worse law in the opposite direction. So it's the wrong way to go. I think your earlier comments about curriculum changes, defunding, I think also appointments. I love Stephen Harper, but I think we dropped the ball there. We should have had a lot more appointments, and institution building. Yuval Levin would support that. One of the ways I got Yuval really excited, you're going to have to go back and watch that discussion.
Yes.
But I asked him, well, Yuval, what do you think about this Schmittian idea? Carl Schmitt, as soon as you mention his name, people say, oh, he was a member of the Nazi Party. He was, and they kicked him out because he wasn't Nazi enough. And furthermore, Leo Strauss, Jewish emigre philosopher to the United States, wrote an essay in support of Schmitt's ideas, just as a way to think about political philosophy. And so I presented this to Yuval. I said, well, what do you think about this friend and enemy as the definition of politics? And he really got excited. He said, no, that is so wrong. That is absolutely wrong if you think of it that way. And it reminded me of some of the comments you were just saying. If we try to adjudicate this in the public arena, where it becomes, no, we're going to force ourselves on you, not only you might lose that debate, but it could be reversed in a very terrible way. But that almost presupposes in your response by saying, yeah, we might lose and lose really big, that almost seems to assume a friend-enemy understanding of politics. Anyway, I'll just let that hang out there. We're at the hour mark. I want you to respond to Schmitt if you want. I'm not a Schmitt fan. I just mentioned his idea because it's, friend-enemy is a common idea out there. But I want you to also tell us what keeps you awake at night besides your 3-year-old and your 5-year-old. Or I think they're 3 and 5. But yeah, tell us what do you worry about? Are you worried that this conversation will go in a bad direction, or do you worry about something completely different? Maybe you think this conversation is using up too much oxygen and we should be thinking about a trade deal with China or something. So close the show.
Well, let me start by saying that I love this conversation. To come back to my opening comments, I just can't believe that this is what I get to do for a living. I'm so blessed that this is part of my vocation. As I say, I remember reading those issues of National Review in the 50s and the 60s were tough. You had people coming back at each other about these questions. And even as a young person, I thought there's something so intellectually stimulating about that. And so I want to assure those with whom I've disagreed, not only is it not personal, I have enjoyed it thoroughly, and I've been grateful for the chance. This is precisely what I want to be doing with my time. And so this doesn't keep me up at night, precisely because I think it's healthy and unending. That if you accept the premise that to be a North American conservative in general, or Canadian conservative in particular, we are rooted in a framework of ordered liberty, we are necessarily going to have ongoing discussions and debates about the relative role of order and the relative role of liberty. And to draw on Goldberg's comment, I will continue to make the case that all things being equal, we should err on the side of liberty, but not in a way that's indifferent to the case for order. What keeps me up at night? I don't know. Probably what keeps me up at night is the weakest part of my argument, in a way, which is I concede that a lot of the concerns about our culture are real and legitimate, that too many people don't have meaning and purpose, that there's obviously a kind of epidemic of loneliness, that the declining fertility rates aren't just a kind of a economic question. They say something about people's kind of commitment or investment in the society and their own kind of understanding of their purpose. What is it? 2/3 of Canadians think their children are going to have worse lives than them. So one way I've come to think about it is the new right sees those circumstances and they don't know how to solve for them. And so they are drawn to the state because it is it's a blunt tool, but it is a kind of tool at our disposal to try to respond to some of those worrying cultural developments. I'm disinclined to use the state, but that doesn't mean that I don't recognize the severity of those challenges. And precisely because I'm disinclined to the state, I'm left with this. As it's often said, what do economists do? When someone falls in the hole, they assume a ladder. I'm left with this, with a non-answer to the fundamental question facing our society, and the only thing I can say is that at some point, somehow, we have some sort of cultural revival, probably rooted in religion, that starts to restore that sense of meaning and purpose that clearly is missing in people's lives. But I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know what will happen in the intervening time. But my faith tells me, in a way, Sean, that it will come in time. And so, on one hand, I worry and I concede it's a kind of gap in my reasoning. On the other hand, I have this sense that somehow, some way, things will get better. But that, I think, probably not only, as I say, the biggest kind of gap in my argument, it's also the biggest challenge for our society.
Yeah, Sean Speer, thank you so much for spending time.
Always good to talk to you. Thanks, Sean.